Hey Fearless Gamers, it's the Wildcard from Fearless Games here, and in this Wildcard Primer I want to talk about the elements of battle in wargaming. If you don't know what I'm talking about, this is kind of I don't want to say a super important thing, but this can definitely help you figure out your personal playstyle. If you're new to wargaming and haven't figured it out yet, it'll help you figure out enemy lists a little bit, and it'll help you look at wargaming in a way that can more quickly assess the situation and figure out what you got to do to win the game. And that's what the elements of elements of battle in wargaming is all about. So there are four elements of battle. They are earth, air, fire, and water. And they're not mutually exclusive. You can have combinations in an army or in a play style. But I'm going to speak of them as if they were mutually exclusive and talk about their particular styles. So this is going to be just a basic overview of the four elements. First up is the earth element, and before I continue, I do want to say this is not so much my interpretation of it, but this is just how I guess it is my interpretation. If you want to get technical about it, but it's my take on it. If you have heard about this, you've probably read about it online somewhere, maybe watched a video on it online as well, and maybe somebody had a little bit different of an opinion on one of the elements, but I think at the core it's pretty much similar. But anyways, here we go. So first up is the earth element. Now the earth element in wargaming is defensive. This is a defensive type of army, or defensive type of style, really. This is a style that benefits from an army that is going to be, if it's melee driven war game, it's an army that's going to be hard to kill. It's going to be slow overall. It may have a couple of quick paced units in it, but in melee driven it's going to be a little bit on the slower end overall in terms of getting to grips with the foe. But it's basically something that's covered head to toe in armor. If you can't tell as a person in there, that's an earth style of unit choice right there. And the idea is you can't really hurt them. They're not necessarily going to just rip through you in one round in melee, but they're going to whittle you down because you're really having a hard time hurting them, and they're not having that much of a hard time hurting you. Now, in a ranged style of game, you're looking at a gun line, basically. Your classic defensive gun line, full of artillery, barrages, things like that. Heavy weapon firepower is what you're looking at in a ranged style war game. You're looking at something that's going to have the biggest guns with the longest range possible. In general, it may have some more short-range, close-up encounter type of stuff, but on the whole, this is going to be more of a static force in the ranged wargaming, with lots of big guns, basically, to pound your enemy into oblivion from a distance. And that's basically Earth in a nutshell right there. It's not the quickest army out there, but it benefits from being more defensive, either hard to kill or just hitting you with lots of firepower, that type of stuff. Maybe a bit of a combination therein, depending upon the game you're playing. So with that being said, let's look at the air element of battle in wargaming. The air element is the only element in the four elements of battle in wargaming which is a direct opposite of one of the other elements. It is basically a direct opposite of Earth. Or Earth is more staticky and slow and massive firepower or hard to kill type of thing. Air is speed and maneuverability. That is its first line of offense, its first line of defense. Its first weapon is its speed and maneuverability. Regardless of whether it's a melee-driven war game or a ranged type of war game, it's going to use its speed and maneuverability to get into favorable positions for itself. A favorable position being something that can harass the enemy's flanks or behind enemy lines type of harassing, deal with supportive units, things like that. In a melee-driven game, it's going to be an army comprised mostly of that fast-paced action type of units. You may have a slow lumbering thing or two out there to support it with, like, let's say a catapult or something like that. But really, it's going to be a unit quick moving and utilizing its maneuverability. If it's not the fastest but has special rules for maneuvering, going to utilize that to get into good positions, to get to the opponent's flanks, to get behind the opponent, to deal with their supportive units, and just overall pick away at the enemy. Death from 1,000 cuts. A ranged combat-driven wargame is no different for an air-styled army. The element of air in a range-driven war game is basically the same. They're going to ride around quick and maneuverable. They're going to get into good positions of firepower, and they're going to use their firepower in a more precise way because they're not going to have loads of big guns out there to just pummel things from a distance with massive shots. They're going to have more of a mid to short range shooting. They're going to be more precise in their shooting, get into good positions, using their speed and maneuverability to get places where they can get favorable shots off with little retaliation from the rest of the enemy army, or get into weaker spots of an enemy unit. In either case, they don't want to be bogged down. So if they're going to commit to getting into melee, in either case, they don't want to be bogged down by it. They want to be able to basically run them through and keep going, or have rules to get out of there. Because if they get bogged down, they're robbed of their initiative, which is their speed. If they're robbed of that, they're basically on the losing end of the spectrum. So that's one thing to keep in mind with an air element style. But in either case, a melee-driven or a range-driven war game, the element of air army will always be on the move. It's always moving, constantly moving, down to the last turn. It's always moving. If it's moving, it's got a better chance of staying alive than if it's staying still. So that's the air element of battle and wargaming. Let's look at the fire element. Now, you're probably getting ideas in your head if you're new to this, from what I've been saying, thinking about the elements and thinking about classics kind of stereotypes for that element a little bit. And you're right to a certain extent to think that way. It'll help you. But the element of fire in wargaming is really about aggression. It's about aggression, but smart. You don't want to be reckless with aggression. If you're reckless and throw caution to the wind and just try to get in with your aggression and don't care about anything else, you're going to lose. They're going to pick you apart. You got to be smart about it, use tactics, know when to basically charge in headlong and race across the battlefield, know when to kind of hang back a bit and utilize the terrain to your advantage, stuff like that. But in either case, they're aggression. Now, how this differs from an air style of army is the fire element doesn't have to keep moving. Once it gets into position, it can stay there and just pound the enemy to oblivion and only move when it needs to move at that point. If it's a melee-driven war game, this is going to be your berserker types, your melee experts, your forces or your army that basically can rip most anything apart in close combat, and/or your horde style of army. Something that's going to have lots of numbers to bear down and be aggressive that way, and just kind of bog them down and swamp them with your numbers. If you're playing in a range style of war game, you can still have a fire type and not have to worry about getting into melee. The fire style of battle here for the elements of battle in a ranged war game is close-in shooting. Instead of having that precise shooting necessarily, but getting to good perfect fields of fire like air does, or instead of pummeling them to dust from a distance like earth does, what fire does is fire gets up close and personal. Fire is up close and personal, and it's from then on, it's not very precise. It just blasts you them to bits with whatever you got, basically. Close in shooting, close in carnage and mayhem. That's a range style of a fire element army. Just close in firefighting is what it is, and that's the fire element. It's more straightforward than most of the other ones because it really is just about being that aggression. It's about getting to grips with your foe, whether it's ranged or melee driven of a war game. It's getting up close and personal. So lastly, that brings us to the element of water in wargaming. And this element is kind of harder to pin down and talk about and give examples on, but I'm going to do my best. Now, the element of water, unlike the other three elements, is less kind of focused on the type of army you're playing. Like a fire element is going to have a very particular type of army to it. Same thing with air and earth. Water is less about that and more about what you're playing against, what the mission is, and the terrain you're going to be playing on. These tend to be more of an elite spec ops style, if you want to think of it that way, to just put image in your head of an army and units. These are things that they're small, but they're well trained usually, and they can deal with a variety of threats and not be kind of blindsided, not be coming up short They can pretty much deal with most situations that come up in that particular game. And the big thing about them is it's not necessarily about the army composition. It's not necessarily about what you're even playing against. Those are good factors to consider, but those factors that you consider fluctuate. I could play against the same person with the same armies, my army and his army. It could be the exact same army. We could play the exact same army game after game after game. If the mission's changing every game, the way I assess my army and his army is going to change. If the terrain changes, but the mission stays the same, again, I may reassess how his army functions and how my army functions. If both are changing, I'm definitely going to reassess everything. That's how it works. Basically, you play to the mission with this type of army. It's an army that, calling it an all-comers type of army kind of makes it sound weak in people's eyes, but that's kind of how it is. It's not so much a jack of all trades, but in a way, it is. You may not literally have all bases covered, but you can have enough answers to things in your forces to kind of be able to deal with things, fall back on redundancies if necessary, and not really worry about the being blindsided. It's not a reactionary force, and that's something to be clear. The water element isn't about just reacting. If you're just reacting in wargame to what your opponent does, you're playing at a disadvantage. You don't want to just react in wargaming. But reacting is a big part of it, of wargaming, and a big part of the water element. But it's not a pure reactionary force. You have your own ideas, you know what the mission is, you know what you got to do to win, and you go about that, but you don't go about it in such a set manner as the other elements, necessarily. Like fire has to be aggressive. If it's passive, it's really not going to be able to do well. It needs to be that aggression. Earth and air need to be what they are. Water can jump from going super aggressive, water can fall back, water can be static. Water does what it needs to do to win that mission. That's a water style of wargaming. None of these elements, in closing, are superior to others. Some may have a natural advantage to another, just in thought, but that's what the whole actual wargaming gaming comes in, and how you're able to deal with things that have an advantage over you because you are weak in close combat and they're strong in it. That's the nature of wargaming. But none of these elements are necessarily superior to the others. Like water is not superior to all three, air is not the superior element, fire isn't. They are all pretty much equal, and it all depends on your play style and what you want to play as. I mean, it basically comes down to your play style, because you will build a list that fits your play style. But knowing what different armies or different factions in the war game that you're playing consist of, knowing that this is an earthen style really type of army and this is more of an air style army, can help you pick the army that's right for you as well, on top of being able to try and win the game. It'll help you get into the game, I want to say correctly, but it'll help you make the right choice off the bat if you're new to wargaming. And anyways, fearless gamers, that's the elements of wargaming. I'll do a more in-depth video for each. I'll do 4 more videos, one for each element, going over my thoughts on playing as that particular element, my thoughts on playing against that particular element, and my thoughts on a mirror match, being you're up against the same exact element. I'll cover those 3 bases in the more in-depth video for each element. So in the comments, leave them, of course. Leave any questions or comments you have. But I'm going to ask you guys, what is your particular element or combination of elements, because they're not mutually exclusive, that you play as, typically? I can tell you mine is I'm water, fire mix. That's how I like to play. Anyways, fearless gamers, that's it. So until next time, take it easy.